Savannah Keller was the kind of girl who existed in a world that most people only ever glimpsed through the glossy pages of luxury magazines or the curated windows of high-end boutiques. At 22 years old, she had never stood in line at a supermarket, never set foot on public transportation, and never worried about the cost of anything. The daughter of Warren Keller, a titan in New York's booming tech sector, Savannah had grown up in a Manhattan penthouse that overlooked Central Park and traveled more in a single year than most would in a lifetime. Her universe was one of rooftop galas, weekend escapes to the Hamptons, and fashion shows in Milan. But that world was about to become distant. Painfully so. The scandal had been sudden and humiliating. A photo had leaked, Savannah exiting a notorious underground club, clearly intoxicated, while wearing a jacket emblazoned with her father's company logo. It might have been harmless to most, just another spoiled socialite on a bender, but for Warren Keller, whose company was undergoing a sensitive federal audit, it was an unneeded disaster. The media pounced, investors panicked, and his daughter's name, once associated with philanthropy and elite internships, became a trending tag for all the wrong reasons. "You need to disappear for a while," Warren had said, his voice clipped, devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for board meetings and press conferences. Someplace quiet. No press, no friends, no drama. And just like that, Savannah found herself exiled to the sleepy town of Belhaven, Massachusetts. Population under 10,000, 2 stoplights, and not a single luxury car dealership in sight. Her Aunt Margaret welcomed her with the polite indifference of someone who had never approved of Savannah's upbringing, but knew better than to voice it out loud. The house was a quaint colonial, modestly furnished and surrounded by trees that turned fire orange and deep red in the early fall. It was a picturesque town, the kind that looked like it belonged on a postcard, but to Savannah, it felt like punishment. In the first few days, she barely left the house. Her phone buzzed endlessly at first, friends checking in, gossiping, sharing memes about her public fall, but after she ignored them all, the silence settled in like fog. Savannah wasn't used to silence. Her world had always been filled with noise, the hum of traffic, clinking champagne glasses, the clicking of stilettos on marble. Here, the loudest sound came from the wind rattling the trees and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. On the 5th morning, unable to tolerate the stillness any longer, she left the house on foot. Belhaven's main street was a short walk away, lined with small businesses, a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and syrup, a bookstore that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s, and a thrift store with sun-faded signs. She walked slowly, hoping for something, anything, to distract her. That was when she saw her, an old woman, hunched beneath a heavy, tattered coat, sat beneath the bus shelter at the edge of the street. Her hair was a wild halo of white, unbrushed and tangled. Her skin was leathered by time and the sun, her hands folded tightly over a worn leather bag that rested on her lap. She looked neither asleep nor fully awake, just present. Still, there was something unsettling about how she stared at the ground, as if waiting for something that would never arrive. Savannah's first instinct was to look away. In New York, you learn quickly to avoid eye contact with people living on the streets. It was a silent, guilty agreement. I won't see you if you don't see me. But this wasn't New York. This woman wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't holding a sign or rattling a cup. She was just sitting there, like a statue eroded by time. For reasons she couldn't explain, Savannah slowed down. Maybe it was because the woman looked out of place in such a quaint town. Maybe it was because, for the first time, Savannah didn't have somewhere else to be. Or maybe, though she would never admit it out loud, it was because something in that empty stare mirrored the hollow way she herself had been feeling. But she kept walking. That night, Savannah couldn't sleep. The mattress in her aunt's guest room was too soft in the wrong way, the air too still. She lay staring at the ceiling, replaying that image of the old woman over and over. The heavy coat, the haunted eyes, the way her fingers had curled possessively around the old leather bag like it held her last breath. She got up and opened her laptop, typing Belhaven Homeless Shelter into the search bar. Nothing came up. There were food drives, yes, and a community church that offered occasional assistance, but no structured place for someone like that woman to go. Savannah closed the tab, frustrated. Why was she even looking? It wasn't her problem. She was here to lie low, not to fix rural poverty. Still, the next morning, Savannah walked past the bus stop again. The woman was there. Same coat, same bag, same stillness. And once again, Savannah walked by, but this time, her steps felt heavier, her guilt more tangible. And something inside her, something she didn't yet understand, had started to shift. The third morning in a row that Savannah saw the woman at the bus stop, she didn't just walk by. She hesitated. There was a chill in the autumn air, sharpened the day before, and the old woman was wearing the same coat, one that looked like it had long since ceased to provide any real warmth. The bag, as always, was clutched to her chest like a fragile secret. Savannah watched from across the street for a long minute, unmoving. She told herself it was curiosity, or maybe pity, that made her cross the street, but somewhere deeper, in a part of herself she wasn't ready to examine. It was something more. She didn't say anything at first, just approached with slow, cautious steps, like one would approach a stray animal. In her hands, she carried a paper bag with a still warm coffee and a folded blanket she had found in her aunt's linen closet. It wasn't designer. It wasn't even new, but it was clean, thick, and smelled faintly of lavender detergent. The woman looked up sharply as Savannah approached, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, her posture tense, the grip on the bag tightening. Savannah stopped a few feet away and crouched slightly, holding the bag out. "I brought you something," she said. Her voice felt foreign in this context, usually used for ordering staff or delivering crisp pleasantries at charity events, now soft and hesitant. The woman didn't speak. Her gaze darted from Savannah's face to the coffee and then to the blanket. Slowly, she extended one hand and took the cup, then the blanket, but her expression remained guarded. "Name's Dorothy," she muttered finally, her voice rough, like gravel underfoot. "Dorothy Lane." Savannah sat down on the edge of the bench, leaving a clear distance between them. "Savannah," she replied simply. A long silence followed. Dorothy sipped the coffee with small, measured gulps, as if rationing each drop. Her eyes, cloudy with age but still sharp beneath, flicked toward Savannah more than once. "You from around here?" she asked, not because she didn't know the answer. It was obvious Savannah was an outsider, but as a kind of test. "Temporarily," Savannah replied. "Staying with my aunt. Just getting away from some things." Dorothy chuckled dryly. "Aren't we all?" The conversation didn't go much further that day, but Savannah returned the next morning, this time with a croissant from the bakery and a pair of wool socks. Dorothy accepted both with a gruff nod, and the two women sat in silence again, watching the small town awaken around them. It became a pattern. Savannah would come early, always bringing something: food, gloves, once a paperback mystery novel, and Dorothy would tolerate her presence with what Savannah could only describe as cautious tolerance. But gradually, the silences began to break. Dorothy told stories in fragments. She had been a teacher once. Art, mostly, lived in New Orleans for years before ending up here. Her voice softened when she spoke about the past, especially when mentioning names Savannah didn't recognize. Old students, friends of an artist collective, gallery owners. But there was a sadness beneath it all, like a brushstroke of gray beneath vibrant color. She never talked about family, and she never explained how she came to be living on a bench in Belhaven. Savannah didn't ask. Not yet, but one thing became immediately apparent. Dorothy never let the bag out her sight, not even when Savannah offered to bring her more comfortable clothes or suggested a place nearby that offered warm showers once a week. The bag was always cradled in her arms or pressed tightly to her side. Its leather was cracked and dry, the stitching worn, and one of the straps had been repaired with shoelace. Savannah caught herself staring at it more than once, trying to guess what it held. Dorothy noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "What's in the bag?" Savannah asked once, casually, as if it weren't the very question that had consumed her curiosity for days. Dorothy didn't answer right away. She looked at Savannah, really looked at her, like she was weighing her worth in that moment. "Memories," she said finally, "some worth more than others." Savannah didn't press further. Not then. Days stretched into a week, and soon the people in town started noticing. A woman like Savannah didn't blend easily. Some shop owners watched her with open curiosity, others with skepticism. No one openly commented on her daily visits to the bus stop, but whispers traveled fast in small towns. It didn't bother her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't care what people thought. She wasn't doing it for appearances. Her aunt, however, was another matter. "You've been disappearing every morning," Margaret remarked over dinner, her fork pausing midair. "Where do you go?" "Just walking," Savannah replied, avoiding eye contact. Margaret didn't push, but the tension in the air suggested she would, eventually. One morning, Dorothy wasn't at the bus stop. Savannah's heart skipped, then sank. She waited for almost an hour before finally spotting a hunched figure down the street, walking slowly with one hand on a lamppost for support. Savannah ran to her instinctively, not thinking, only reacting. Dorothy looked pale, her skin waxy, breath shallow. "You need to sit," Savannah said, supporting her weight. "You don't look well." "I'm fine," Dorothy insisted, but her voice betrayed her. She collapsed before they reached the bench. Panic surged through Savannah like electricity. She fumbled with her phone, called emergency services, gave a location with shaking hands. The paramedics arrived quickly. Belhaven was small and response times were short, but in the chaos, one thing stayed constant. Dorothy would not release the bag, even unconscious. Her fingers were curled around the strap, her arm wrapped around it like armor. Savannah rode to the hospital in the back of the ambulance, a nurse allowing her to sit beside the stretcher. She held Dorothy's hand the entire way, heart pounding, unsure if it was fear for the woman or fear of what might be inside that bag if it ever opened. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and humming machinery. Savannah sat stiffly in a corner chair, watching the monitor above Dorothy's hospital bed with intensity that belied her understanding of what the numbers meant. The old woman lay still, for taped to her fragile arm, oxygen tubes framing her face. Her coat had been removed by a nurse, and a heavy bag now rested on the table beside the bed, untouched but ever present. Savannah had refused to let out her sight, a request met with indifference by the hospital staff more concerned with stabilizing the patient than handling her belongings. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. A young doctor updated Savannah with cautious optimism. Dorothy had likely suffered from a severe drop in blood pressure, exacerbated by dehydration and cold. She would recover, but slowly, and she would be admitted overnight for observation. Savannah nodded mechanically at the information, thanked him, and returned to her seat. Her eyes returned to the bag. It sat there like a living thing, small, weathered, unassuming. But now, without Dorothy's iron grip to guard it, it felt like an invitation. Savannah hesitated. She wasn't proud of the thought forming in her mind, nor the impulse that followed, but it was there, persistent, undeniable. She told herself it was necessary. The hospital might need identification, medical history, contact information. If Dorothy had those things, they would be inside. With a glance toward the open door and a breath held tight in her chest, Savannah reached for the bag. The leather was softer than she expected, warm from use. She opened it slowly, inch by inch, careful not to disturb anything inside. The first layer revealed ordinary items: a small, empty wallet, a wrapped granola bar, an old hairbrush with more bristles missing than intact. Then, something else, flat, carefully wrapped in a worn handkerchief. Savannah unfolded it gently. Her breath caught. It was a drawing, a small piece on thick paper, signed with a name she recognized instantly, because she had once attended an exhibit of his work in Manhattan. Emile Duffert, a surrealist who had passed away 5 years earlier, now commanding six-figure sums at auction for original pieces. She stared at the signature, then at the image itself, a delicate, haunting composition in charcoal. It was real, she had no doubt. She pulled out more items, slowly, methodically. Another sketch, this time signed by Lila Marr, an abstract expressionist now considered a darling of the modern art world. A tiny canvas painted in vibrant reds and golds, unmistakably the early work of Zachary Holt, known for rejecting commercial galleries, and instead leaving works anonymously in urban spaces. Savannah recognized the style. She had seen a piece just like it sell at Sotheby's for over $100,000. Beneath these, folded carefully and bound with string, was a yellowed envelope. Her hands trembling now, Savannah untied it and slid out a typed letter, faded but legible. It was addressed to Dorothy Lane, dated 1987, signed by the director of the Viridian Gallery in New Orleans. The tone was formal but personal, discussing the upcoming closure of the gallery due to legal issues and instructing Dorothy to safeguard the student collections until further notice. The letter referenced a list, one not included, and mentioned accusations being circulated about the gallery's finances. At the bottom, handwritten in ink, was a note: "Keep them close, Dorothy. If anything happens, you know why." Savannah sat back, the pages trembling in her lap. These weren't stolen works. They were entrusted to Dorothy, possibly decades ago, under a cloud of controversy and institutional collapse. But if the gallery had closed and no one had come forward in all that time, how had Dorothy ended up alone, unrecognized, living under a blanket at a bus stop? She flipped the envelope over and found something else, a legal document, partially filled out but never signed. It was a draft petition for claim of property, naming Dorothy as custodian of the artworks. Attached was a typed inventory with names of artists and brief descriptions of their works. It was a treasure map, not a buried gold, but of art worth millions. Savannah stood slowly, glancing toward the hallway. Her mind raced. She needed help, but not from just anyone, not from the local sheriff or hospital social worker. She needed someone who would understand the weight of what she had found, someone who knew art law, provenance, and, most importantly, discretion. After securing everything back inside the bag, folded precisely as she had found it, Savannah left the hospital and drove straight to her aunt's house. Margaret was in the kitchen when she arrived, but Savannah didn't stop to explain. She went upstairs, pulled out her laptop, and searched for one name: Alan Greenwald. He had been a family contact for years, a semi-retired lawyer who specialized in estate claims and intellectual property. Savannah remembered he had once helped her father navigate a complex acquisition involving a media company with dozens of disputed creative assets. He owed her father favors. She hoped that extended to her. She called. He answered on the second ring. "Savannah Keller," he said, surprised. "I assume this isn't a social call." "I need your help," she said without preamble. "It's about art, legal ownership, and a woman who might be sitting on millions without knowing it, or maybe knowing but being ignored. I need to talk to you in person." There was a pause. "Where are you?" "Bellhaven, Massachusetts." Another pause. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." When she returned to the hospital that night, Dorothy was awake but weak. Her voice was softer, less guarded, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "You looked," she said without accusation, only quiet understanding. Savannah didn't lie. "I had to," she said. "They needed your ID and I needed answers." Dorothy nodded slowly. "And now you know." "I don't know everything, but I want to." Dorothy's gaze lingered on her for a long time. "Then you better be ready," she said. "Because the truth, it doesn't always come clean." Alan Greenwald arrived in Bellhaven the next morning in a dark blue sedan that looked entirely too polished for the cracked streets of the small town. He was in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a wool overcoat and leather gloves, carrying a briefcase that might have cost more than most homes on the block. Savannah met him outside the hospital, her arms crossed against the cold, her face set in quiet determination. She wasted no time. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, they walked inside, and she led him straight to Dorothy's room. Dorothy was sitting upright in bed, looking stronger, her bag nestled on her lap like a shield. She watched the stranger with narrowed eyes as he entered. Savannah spoke gently, introducing Alan and explaining why he was there. At first, Dorothy said nothing. Her fingers remained curled around the edge of the bag, and her expression was unreadable. But when Alan removed his gloves and opened his briefcase, revealing a printed copy of the gallery letter and inventory list Savannah had scanned the night before, something shifted in her posture. She leaned forward slightly. "You were the one who brought this to light?" Alan asked her, his voice low, measured. "I never wanted to," Dorothy replied. "Not like this. But I knew it would come eventually." Alan nodded. Then maybe now is the time to finally put things in order. Dorothy hesitated, then glanced at Savannah. Whatever silent trust had begun to form between them solidified in that moment. With a sigh, Dorothy placed a bag on the bed beside her and began to speak. She had been 29 when she moved to New Orleans, recently divorced and full of ambition. She had taken a position at the Viridian Gallery as an assistant curator and quickly climbed through the ranks. It was more than just a job. It became her life. The gallery focused on emerging artists, offering space, mentorship, and exposure to talents overlooked by the mainstream art world. It was a chaotic, eclectic environment, filled with raw creativity and unpolished genius. Dorothy had nurtured that, poured herself into it. She had mentored some of the very names that now grace the art world's elite. But the gallery's finances had always been unstable, and when its director, a man named Arthur Bellamy, became the subject of federal investigation for tax evasion and fraud, the entire institution collapsed. The official narrative was that Bellamy had misappropriated funds, used the gallery's assets to launder money, and left a trail of ruined reputations behind. Dorothy, devastated and disillusioned, had tried to protect the only thing that mattered, the art. According to her, Bellamy had instructed her, just before disappearing from public view, to safeguard a portion of the works, those not officially registered with the gallery's assets but gifted by students, artists, and friends. He had promised to resolve the legal issues and return. He never did. The remaining trustees turned on Dorothy, accusing her of theft. Without documentation or legal protection, she had no defense. Her own family, angry, embarrassed, had intervened not to support her, but to remove her. They'd arranged for her to be committed under the guise of concern for her mental health. She escaped that fate only by vanishing, taking the bag and the works she could carry. For decades, she drifted, moving from city to city, never staying long, always guarding the bag. When she reached Belhaven, she was too tired to keep running and too proud to ask for help. So she stayed, invisible to the world, waiting for a time when the truth might finally matter again. Alan listened in silence, taking notes. When she finished, he closed his notebook and exhaled slowly. "Do you still have the original inventory list?" Dorothy nodded and pulled it from a pocket inside the bag. It was worn, creased from age and folding, but legible. Alan studied it carefully. "With this," he said, "and the letter, we have a compelling case to claim legal custodianship of the works, especially if we can prove that the gallery's board never formally disputed ownership in court." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "And if they do now, then they'll have to fight a very public, very expensive battle. But the world has changed, Mrs. Lane. Sympathy tends to lean toward the forgotten, not the institutions that let them vanish." Savannah felt a quiet thrill at those words. For once, the system might actually protect someone like Dorothy. Over the next few days, Alan began the paperwork necessary to file a claim on Dorothy's behalf. Savannah contacted a small but reputable museum in Boston to initiate a discreet appraisal of the works. The valuation came back staggering. Over $2 million in total, and that was a conservative estimate. Dorothy took the news with calm disbelief. She didn't smile, didn't react with the excitement Savannah had expected. Instead, she grew quiet. Later that evening, while Savannah helped her fold a hospital blanket neatly at the foot of the bed, Dorothy finally spoke. "I didn't keep them for the money," she said. "I kept them because someone had to remember, because those pieces were promises, from them to me and from me to the world." Savannah nodded. "I know, but now, maybe the world will finally remember too." Word of the case began to ripple through art circles, initially in hushed conversations, then louder. A journalist from a regional newspaper caught wind of it and requested an interview. Dorothy declined. Savannah stepped in, insisting the story be told respectfully, without sensationalism. The article, published a week later, was titled "The Curator Who Carried a Museum in Her Bag." In it, Savannah's role was mentioned briefly, but it was Dorothy's story that resonated. Her sacrifice, her silence, and the quiet rebellion of preserving beauty in a world that had discarded her. The story went viral. Offers came in gallery exhibits, television interviews, foundations wanting to partner. Dorothy turned most of them down. She accepted one offer only, a modest proposal from a local Belhaven Art Center to host a community exhibit of the recovered works. No red carpets, no champagne receptions, just a quiet opening night, open to the public free of charge. When the event arrived, Savannah stood beside Dorothy as family, students, and curious townspeople wandered the gallery. Dorothy wore a new coat, simple, gray, warm. Her eyes scanned the room, not with pride, but with the gentle satisfaction of someone who had finally, after a lifetime of being unheard, been allowed to speak. And Savannah, she felt something she hadn't in years, clarity. She realized that in helping Dorothy, she had uncovered more than forgotten art. She had unearthed her own purpose. The morning after the exhibit, Savannah walked into the modest kitchen of her aunt's home with a strange sense of calm. The entire town was still buzzing from the event. For weeks, Belhaven had lived in quiet rhythm, but now it seemed everyone had something to say about the woman from the bus stop and the once disgraced daughter of a tech billionaire who had, against all odds, helped her reclaim a piece of the past. Savannah wasn't interested in attention. Not anymore. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the conversation she and Dorothy had shared the night before, once the last guest had left the exhibit and the gallery doors had been locked. They had stood alone in front of one of the smaller works, an abstract in swirling greens and ochres painted by one of Dorothy's former students, now a major figure in the San Francisco art scene. Dorothy had touched the edge of the frame lightly and said, "He gave me that after his first solo show. Told me I was the first person who believed he could do something more than graffiti." Savannah had looked at her then, and there was no mistaking it. The ache in Dorothy's eyes, not for the value of the painting, but for the time, the people, the younger self who had once lived fully in that world. There was so much history trapped inside that bag, inside those canvases and sketches, that no auction or exhibit could ever reflect. And that night, for the first time, Savannah asked her the question she had been holding in for days. "What are you going to do now?" Dorothy hadn't answered right away. She had just stared at the painting, her lips pressed in a thoughtful line. Eventually, she said, "I want to stop hiding." Now, sitting in that kitchen with her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, Savannah took a long breath and made a decision. It was time to move forward. Not alone, but not following anyone else's path either. The scandal in New York no longer haunted her the way it had. Her father's silence, her friend's sudden disappearance, the tabloids that had built her up only to tear her down, they all felt like remnants of a life she had outgrown. When she visited Dorothy later that day at the small apartment the older woman had recently rented, she found her by the window, sketching. The space was simple, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but filled with light. Sun streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating the table where pencils and paper were scattered in soft disarray. On the wall hung a single photograph, a black and white shot of the Viridian Gallery from the 1980s, its sign barely legible in the frame. Savannah pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "I've been thinking," she began, "about what happens next for both of us." Dorothy didn't look up. "And what do you see?" "A chance," Savannah said. "Not just for you to be remembered or for those paintings to be seen again, but for other people like you. Artists without homes, elders forgotten by their families, people who have something to give but nowhere to go." Dorothy's pencil paused midline. "I want to build something. A foundation." Savannah continued, the words spilling out faster now. "A place where street artists, aging creatives, anyone with a story, they can come, share, teach. A community studio. We'll call it Lane House." Dorothy blinked. Finally looking up, her face was unreadable. "Lane House. For you," Savannah said, softer now, "because your name should mean something more than a whisper on a bench. And because if it weren't for you, I'd still be the girl who never looked to the sides." There was a long pause between them, the kind of silence that held weight, not awkwardness. Then Dorothy smiled. It wasn't broad, but it was real, and it lit her entire face. "I think that's the best idea I've heard in 50 years. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Savannah began the paperwork for the nonprofit. Alan Greenwald offered to handle the legal structuring pro bono. A small office in town became their first base of operations, and Savannah tapped into her old network, carefully, selectively, to raise the initial funds. To her surprise, a few contacts responded not with suspicion or gossip, but genuine interest. It seemed that the same story that had once cast her out of her father's world was now becoming the thing that redefined her. Lane House launched its first project that winter, a mobile art program that brought supplies and volunteers to community shelters across Massachusetts. Dorothy, with her decades of experience and unshakable eye for talent, became its creative director. She held informal classes, sometimes under bridges or in community centers, her once hidden knowledge now shared openly. She carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The press came knocking again, but this time, Savannah controlled the narrative. She agreed to one in-depth profile with a respected journalist. Not a celebrity puff piece, but a raw, honest article about second chances, justice, and how a woman nearly erased by the world had inspired change. The title read, "The Bus Stop, the Bag, and the $1 Billion Lie." It trended for weeks. Despite the attention, they kept things small, intentional. The studio, when it finally opened in a refurbished school building, bore the original Viridian door plaque mounted on the front wall, a quiet nod to the place where it all began. Inside, artists of all ages worked side by side. Retired painters sat beside teenagers sketching their first characters. Formerly homeless veterans sculpted clay figures with arthritic hands. And in the corner, always observing, always teaching, was Dorothy. One afternoon, as Savannah locked up after a long day, she saw Dorothy sitting in the back garden, watching the sun dip below the trees. She walked over and sat beside her on the bench. "You never went back to New York," Dorothy said, her eyes on the horizon. "I didn't need to," Savannah replied. Dorothy nodded, then added, "You became something better than what you were raised to be." Savannah looked at her, her voice quiet. "You saved me, without ever asking for anything." Dorothy didn't respond right away. Then, she turned to her with a look that blended affection and wisdom. "No," she said, "we saved each other." And in the hush of twilight, surrounded by the sound of wind to the trees and the distant hum of traffic, Savannah Keller, once a headline, now a builder, understood what it meant to start again, not as a daughter of privilege or a fallen socialite, but as a woman who had finally learned the value of seeing the unseen.